Hey, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today and for joining us for our webinar about the 2024 Jumping Worm Jamboree. My name is Amy Jewett, and I am the Pennsylvania IMAP Invasives Program Coordinator at the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program. And I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Anise Dobson of Yale University. She's going to be helping to co-present for our presentation today. Just want to mention a few quick things before we get started. The presentation is going to be recorded, and everyone who registered will receive a copy of the recording afterwards. Folks will also receive a copy of my presentation as well as Anissa's presentation. So you will have this information to reference later on as well. There is a Q&A feature available in our webinar today. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask either during the webinar or at the very end, you are welcome to use that feature to type in your questions as they come to you. And Anise and I will do our best to answer your questions either during the training or we will answer them at the very end. So again, thank you so much for being here today, and we will go ahead and get started. So the purpose of the Jumping Worm Jamboree, which I will mention is a new event, we have not done this before, is first and foremost to have folks go out and search for invasive jumping worms. So this event is for both natural resource professionals and also members of the public, what we refer to as community scientists. And so we encourage you to go out and search for these species in areas across Pennsylvania, and that can include searching in your own residential yard and garden, also public parks and forests or commercial areas. So essentially any space where you are finding greenery growing or there is soil there, there is potential that there could be jumping worms present. So another thing that we are trying to do as part of hosting this event is to teach participants how to correctly identify jumping worms. And so again, I'm really pleased to have Dr. Anise Dobson from Yale University join us today. She is an expert in jumping worms and will provide information on how to identify them and also how to tell them apart from other species of earthworms. And finally, just because jumping worms are not necessarily a new species to our state, but they are relatively new to public knowledge, we are hoping to help raise awareness of these species with as many people as possible and have foster a better understanding of the harm that they can cause and how they can negatively impact Pennsylvania's environment and economy. So as far as the event itself, if you are interested in participating in the Jumping Worm Jamboree, we are asking folks to go out and search for these species and to use the IMAP Invasives platform to document your survey findings. You can make a report using either the IMAP Invasives mobile app or the IMAP Invasives online database. Both presence and absence information should be reported. So that's essentially referring to if you go out and search for a jumping worm and you find it, that would be presence information. If you go and you search for jumping worms and you do not find them, we also want to know about that as well. We're referring to that as absence, or in IMAP, it's called not detected information. And for purposes of this event, the absence or not detected findings are valuable just because it shows us where people are surveying and may not necessarily be finding anything, but we can see the scope of where you are conducting your surveys across the state. So we have both that presence and absence information. So if you're interested in using the IMAP Invasives mobile app to report your findings, which I would certainly encourage, it makes reporting while you're outside in the field a lot easier and quicker than having to come back to your home office. You can download the IMAP Invasives mobile app to your devices from your device's app store. You would search for IMAP Invasives mobile in order to download that. And then just for reference, when you're making a worm report to IMAP invasives, because it can be somewhat difficult to identify these species down to the species level, we're only asking participants to identify them or at least record your findings to the genus level. So in our IMAP invasives species list, look for where it says jumping worms species unknown. And it will be fine just to record all of your findings under that title. You don't need to go any further than that. So when you are recording information, go ahead and use whatever technology you prefer. You can use a smartphone, a tablet, or a laptop or desktop computer, so whatever you're most comfortable with. I would encourage our smartphone and tablet users to utilize the IMAP Invasives mobile app. And then for laptop and desktop users, I would encourage you to use our IMAP Invasives online database to make your reports. And just a quick note for any folks that are using a tablet with the IMAP Invasives mobile app, you do need to make sure that your tablet has GPS capability because that is needed for the app. Some tablets do not have that component, so you do want to make sure that your tablet has that if you'd like to use the mobile app. And then as far as when to conduct your surveys for jumping worms, the Jamboree event is going throughout the month of July. So anywhere from the 1st to the 31st of July is when you can go out and survey for these species as part of this event. And then just want to kind of provide a little bit of background information as far as where jumping worms have been found so far in Pennsylvania. So according to confirmed data from IMAP invasives, jumping worms have been found in 24 of our state's 67 counties. So around roughly a third of our state has these species present, according to documented information. There is some unconfirmed, unvetted information in IMAP invasives currently that is awaiting expert review. So likely there are additional counties that can help fill out this map a little bit more once we have a chance to look at that information. And then I'm certainly assuming that just based on data that we will get from this event and folks that participate, we will find that additional counties in our state probably have jumping worms present as well. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Dr. Dobson. She is going to give more information about jumping worms.
All right. Amy, just confirmation that the screen looks good, the audio sounds good.
Yep, everything's good.
Fantastic. All right, thank you all so much for being here today. I've done a number of these IMAP mapping challenges in in New York State and other states. And having this way of getting all of this data from all of you has been so useful to me. It helps us in the publications that we make, the observations about how they're moving, where they are, and it really lets us do these big regional studies. Pennsylvania is a big state. I live in Connecticut. I work in Vermont and sort of states all throughout the Northeast region and have collaborators there. And we're able to do these big regional studies because we get information like this that tells us where there are jumping worms and where there are not jumping worms. Both of those little pieces of information are really, really important to us. And I'm going to welcome you to put questions into, into the chat as you go. And I think that there'll also be a little bit of time at the end for that too. All right, so a little introduction about earthworms in North America. So for the most part, we don't have in the sort of northern region of North America, we don't have a lot of native earthworms. The ice sheet knocked a lot of them back. But even here in Pennsylvania, where you're beyond where the last glaciation went to, the native earthworm population is pretty small and they're not in a great abundance. And so what we're seeing all across the globe is this phenomenon called global warming, where a very small number of the 7,000 or so species of earthworm out there are invasive. And this is happening in temperate ecosystems. This is happening in tropical ecosystems. In Pennsylvania, it's really interesting. You have all of these different things happening where in some parts further south, invasive earthworms are going to be displacing native earthworms. In some other places further in the northeast of the state, they're displacing earlier invasions. So jumping worms are the later invasion that might be displacing some of the earlier invasions from Europe. And then in some cases, invading into new habitats that had no earthworms at all. So historically, the forests of Pennsylvania look a little bit like this cartoon on the left, where all of the leaf litter that's falling down onto the surface is decomposed pretty slowly by a really huge diversity of microbes and soil fauna and things like that. And what you get is a buildup of an organic horizon that's a really unique habitat that a lot of things have evolved in. So a lot of the plants have evolved to germinate in those conditions. A lot of the things like salamanders and millipedes take cues from their environment about timing, when to bury down, when to come up to mate, etc. So this microhabitat of the forest floor has had a huge role in shaping the forests of Pennsylvania. When earthworms moved in, sort of between now and even as far back as 200 years ago, that organic horizon at the top got mixed up really rapidly. And so what you see, instead of having distinct soil horizons and that thick organic layer, you get a pretty homogeneous soil profile as you go down. Jumping worms in particular they're staying mostly at the surface and they're depositing their castings as a thick layer on the top of this surface. So jumping worms are one of a number of different families of what we call earthworms. So these ones are in Megascalecidae. The ones like night crawlers that you'll be maybe more familiar with, they're in the family Lumbricidae. So I'm going to make some comparisons between those today. The taxonomy is a little bit tricky. The the database folks must be very annoyed because every couple of years we have a new recommendation of what it should be called. So sometimes you'll hear Amenthus and Metaphire as the two genera. Maybe it's those two, maybe it's just Amenthus, but certainly there's a number of different species that look very similar and are co-invading all together at the same time. So for the purposes of IMAP and for any kind of management purposes, referring to them as jumping worms by the family Megascalecidae or by Amenthus Metaphire is sufficient. We don't have a ton of data really about how the different species behave anyway. In North America, they were or in this region in the Northeast, they were introduced from East Asia around the 1940s, probably introduced many, many different times as opposed to just once. So they've been here, as Amy mentioned, for a fairly long time. It's not like beech leaf disease that showed up and is moving very fast. It's something that's been here, but it's really just seen a population expansion, a population explosion really over the last 10 or 20 years. In Pennsylvania, the earliest record that I could find was also in about the 1940s, so about the same as the rest of the region. The problem with jumping worms is not the individual worms or what they do, but just the huge volume that they can get to, the capacity to grow fast, reproduce fast, and re-engineer so much soil. So this is kind of the density that you can find them on the forest floor on a rainy day in August or September. And the problem with them stems from this re-engineering of the soil. So I was talking about your historical Pennsylvania soil. It might look something like this one on the left, where there's that leaf litter that's fallen. That's the organic horizon I was talking about. Great habitat for all sorts of other soil fauna and beetles and mites and fungi and things like that. this middle one, this is what happens when those lumbricid earthworms come in, homogenize the soil, mix things up. And then the jumping worms, this is a little bit harder to take a picture of. These are soil profiles. So like you dig a hole and you take a picture of the side of the hole, the soil hole. The castings are really, really crumbly and they just fall in. So it's a little bit tricky to get a picture, but these castings will tend to be in the top 6 inches, 12 inches even of the soil. And really, this picture, I think, is kind of the crux of the problem. So you're changing the soil from what it has been historically to this really gravelly, crazy textured soil that is very crumbly, easily erodible, and really dries out. So you'll see a number of different seeds that have tried to germinate, but because the soil doesn't retain very much moisture, they just all kind of didn't make it. So there's not a whole lot going on in this in terms of flora or fauna. And so, of course, if you're re-engineering the soil, that's going to have impacts on plants. And one thing that we find is that invasive jumping worms make all of the other stressors in the forests um, so much worse. So things like really high deer abundance that you have in some places, invasive plants that themselves alone are not necessarily a huge problem, but when you're compounding the jumping worms with some of these other stressors, climate change, insect outbreaks, that's when you see extinctions of native plant species. So you're re-engineering the soil, changing the plant community, and of course that's going to have impacts on the soil fauna that are living there, but also some of the bigger and more charismatic things that rely on the plants for food and habitat and things like that. The economic impacts, we're only starting to kind of scratch the surface on what this looks like. And a lot of this has come from observations of people on the ground that are working in these different places that have mentioned things here and there. So certainly impacts to logging and tree regeneration. A big one, golf courses have been kind of dealing with this for a long time, turf grass folks. But this also extends to things like soccer fields and other sort of places where grass is really, really important. Certainly the mulch industry, mulch is a big way that jumping worms can be transported. So thinking a little bit about, so people that supply mulch have to think about that supply chain a little bit more. Another big one that happens is, I mentioned the castings are really easily erodible. And so those castings then get into waterways, especially when you have a big rain event, a big storm event, and they can clog up stormwater drains, agricultural fields and drainage from fields and things like that. So you can get a lot of issues with water drainage. Farms, agriculture, horticulture. This one it's not necessarily a huge problem for people working with annuals where they're rototilling, but if you've got perennials, if you've got orchards, issues around that are starting to crop up. Plant sales, community plant sales. A lot of communities have these, and they're really these wonderful gems. But where you're sourcing plants from individual homes, you have to be a little bit careful about spreading jumping worms through the soil. So plant sales don't have to stop, but they require a lot more input from people to make sure that the plants being sold are jumping worm free. And then going back to the erosion problem, we see a lot of infrastructure on trails getting eroded, riversides, riverbanks, and even things like retaining walls. This is the wall of someone's house that they sent me, where they found jumping worms kind of chewing away on the sort of concrete between the bricks and pooping out castings of concrete. Like it's there's no end to the potential economic impacts that they can have. So identifying a jumping worm invasion. I mentioned that they've been here for a really long time, but they're not everywhere and they don't move very quickly. And what we do and knowing about where they are has a huge impact. So this is where you all can be just extremely helpful, as well as it being a fun challenge. Um, One thing that you can do all year round is look for that soil. Even if you don't see the worms, if it's really dry or if it's the middle of winter, you can still notice the differences in soil. So if it's really, really spongy, probably no earthworms, there are very few. If it looks really homogeneous, mixed up soil, that's a sense that maybe you have these lumbricid earthworms from Europe. And then where you have this kind of coffee ground, pebbly soil, that's characteristic of jumping worms. So right now we're here between June and July. I was in Ithaca, New York yesterday, and the jumping worms were very, very tiny, certainly not into adults. Here in Connecticut, they're definitely adults by now. So depending on where you are in the state, they may be adults, they may be quite small. But they're also not always visible. They tend to retreat if it's really dry, either deep into the soil or back into a more moist area. So depending on where you fall in this life cycle and with the weather, you want to think about looking just for the soil. You can also sometimes find the cocoons. They look like a little pellet of slow release fertilizer. And they're visible to the naked eye. So the first thing you do is looking for the soil, and then at this time of year, you can look for the worms themselves. And the nice thing for this challenge at least, is that you don't have to dig, you don't have to do any kind of mustard pour or anything like that. The jumping worms stay pretty close to the surface. So if you scrape back last year's leaf litter, they'll often just be kind of right under the surface, like this picture here. The behavior is a really key thing to look for when you see this. So they thrash around, they move across the soil in a way that kind of looks like snakes. They're also sometimes called snake worms. Versus if you disturb one of the lumbricid earthworms, it sort of bends itself around and sort of moves much more slowly and ties itself up in knots. But really, really different behavior. And then if you manage to get a look up close, the main one that you're going to confuse a jumping worm with is the night crawler. They're both quite big, around 20 centimeters when they're mature, maybe even more. And they can be fairly darkly pigmented. So a few differences: the jumping worm here on the left, the night crawler here on the right. The jumping worm is going to be quite pigmented all the way down the worm. It's going to be sort of purple or pink or even brown, all the way down the worm. Versus in this night crawler, it tends to live in these deep burrows. And so while the head comes up and is quite pigmented, the tail usually stays underground. So it's not really exposed to too much light. So it's quite pale, the tail end. Another thing that you might notice on the lumbricid earthworms is that the tail, especially if it's moving and propelling itself along the ground, is going to be a little bit flattened. So we call it a beaver tail. And then a third thing you want to look for is the clitellum. So starting around now, later into the year, if they're becoming mature, you'll see this little band here. And that can be really helpful for identification purposes. On the jumping worms, it's quite close to the head. So in the first 10% or so of the worm. And then in the lumbricid earthworm, it's much closer to the middle. So down about a third of the way down the worm. The clitellum also has other features that can help you identify it. So on the jumping worm, it's a ring, so it goes all the way around the circle of the body of the worm. And on the lumbricid earthworms, it's much more just on the back of the worm. So we call it a satellite clitellum. So if you want to have a quick way to remember it, you can imagine this dog with his inner tube. That's like the jumping worm all the way around, flush with the body. And then this horse with the saddle, that's like the lumbricid earthworm. But if you are in one of those places where the jumping worms have not matured, that's going to be a little bit trickier to identify. If you have juveniles. So one thing that you can do if you have a hand lens is you can look at them a little bit up close, look at the segments and what the little bristle-like hairs look like. So on the jumping worms, there are all of these tiny little hairs all the way around the body of the worm. And on the lumbricid earthworms, the night crawlers, they're going to be paired, and there might be uh, something like 10 different setae instead of like 100. So once you've done your visual and you've looked at the soil, you've done your visual inspection, that's when it's time to upload the presence or not detected data to IMAP invasives. And again, that not detected data is really useful to me when I'm designing experiments to be able to find places that do and do not have jumping worms. So I know that it's fun to find them, but it's also very fun to not find them. As Amy mentioned before, they are pretty broadly distributed across the state. But jumping worms are really different than a lot of other invasive species, where just because they're on one property in one place does not mean they're next door. They don't move very much on their own. It's really us moving them, maybe moving through waterways and erosion. But having that fine scale detail is really, really key. So even if you're in a state where jumping worms have been detected, that information is just as valuable if you have more jumping worms there. So you can take multiple images for yourself and pick the best one when you're in the field. Once you've taken your picture, you can dispose of the worms by freezing them. That's kind of the sort of most ethical way that I know of, that they just kind of go to sleep. Heating or ethanol will also kill them, but that one's maybe not quite as pleasant for them. And then in your observations, if you notice anything that you think is interesting about the behavior, about the habitat, about where you think it might have come from, observations about the soil, if you see that granular soil, those are all things you can add in as observations in the comments. I would have never thought anything about earthworms and them impacting or jumping worms impacting the retaining walls and houses if people hadn't have just sort of passed along this interesting observation. When you're taking your photograph, really helpful if you can add some of that soil, that castings in with your photo, especially if they're juveniles, they can be a little bit hard to identify from a picture. So the castings, if you can add that in, that would be really helpful. Mature specimens where possible with a clitellum, so that band right here. Ensuring good resolution. And it would be great if you could include an item for scale as well, something like a ruler, but if you don't have a ruler, a penny or a key or something like that. Contrasting background for the picture is great. The New York IMAP folks had a great suggestion, which was a white takeout container, because that keeps the worms kind of in place and has a nice contrast. Straightening the worm can help to identify it. And even though it might be tempting to pick up 100 worms and take a picture of that, really 1 to 3 is kind of the maximum that we need, and more isn't helpful in this case for identification. All right, so quick summary about identification. When you're working with IMAP, you're inspecting the soil, you're observing that thrashing behavior. If they're juveniles, you're going to see if you can see that setae in a ring around each segment. And if they're adults, then you're in luck. That's much easier. You can look for the clitellum, the inner tube clitellum, close to the head end of the worm. And if you do find jumping worms, let's say on a property that you own or that you manage or that you love, um, you want to think a little bit about the about management and prevention. So we don't really have any good management at the moment for jumping worms. There's some research being done, but for the most part, putting the emphasis on prevention of spread is key. And it's actually really, really effective for jumping worms. And there's really small things that you can do to make a huge difference. And the reason for that is that invasive species exist on this continuum of how important humans are to their spread. So chestnut blight, for example, showed up also at the Bronx Zoo, similar to jumping worms in the early 20th century. And without very much human intervention, it had spread across North America. There was really not a ton that could be done in terms of modifying human behavior. And then we have things like the emerald ash borer, where we stopped moving firewood and we had some other interventions in how we move wood around. And that had some impact in slowing the spread. It didn't stop it, but human intervention was like pretty important for that. Jumping worms are on this far end of the extreme where if we can modify our own behavior, we can really, really slow them down. So putting some thought into things like planting bare root. You don't have to treat roots, let's say if you're doing a plant sale, as contaminated or anything like that, because the cocoons are visible to the naked eye. So just visually inspecting that there isn't big clumps of soil, rinsing the roots, repotting in clean soil. That's all just fine. Making sure that for compost, you're sticking to the red wigglers and not jumping worms. Not dumping yard waste into natural areas. So this is a big pathway that I see them getting into the forests, is people will do some landscaping and then they'll dump the landscaping materials into a natural area. Shopping local and communicating with local businesses is really key. I know a lot of landscaping companies that are able to charge a premium for making sure that they address some of these concerns. Thinking a little bit about the mulch, the topsoil, and the compost that comes into your property. So either ensuring that it's for mulch. If it's come straight from the tree to the truck to you, that's great. If it's sitting around in a pile somewhere on someone's property that might have jumping worms, that's where you might want to heat treat it, say under some plastic for a few days in the summer before putting it out. Also thinking about soil and compost, either from a clean source or heat treated. It doesn't have to be really high, just 104 Fahrenheit over the course of 3-ish days. So if you can like leave the bag of compost in the hot car for 3 days or something like that. Better still, making your own mulch and compost. So in some cases, tree removal businesses would love to get rid of their mulch and will just give it to you for free. And doing it on your own property or compost, doing it on your own property or locally where you know the supply chain can be really useful. Another big way that it can get into places is from some of these like equipment and tire treads that carry a lot of soil. The cocoons will be transported in there. So if you've got logging or landscaping contracts, just putting in that extra step of spraying down the equipment between different sites. And this is also going to help for all sorts of other invasive plant seeds that can get lodged in. If you've ever been into any places that have been logged, sometimes they have a lot of invasive plants that have come in on the tire treads. So you can include these details in contracts, and if you're a provider, you can potentially charge a little bit more for this extra service. If you're doing planting, checking the roots. So again, you can see that soil if you just pop the plant out. This is some nice, clean looking tomato plant, no jumping worms in here. But here, this is a plant that has those jumping worms castings in it. And if you do have jumping worms, you can think about cultivating deep-rooted species. Most of their impacts are in the shallow layers of the soil. So putting in deep-rooted species, bigger individuals. Thinking if you're sort of landscaping, thinking about pollinator and prairie gardens, these can have really matted roots that jumping worms tend to not like. So they can sort of keep them out, keep them at bay, and they have all sorts of other benefits for native species. Um, One thing that's come up in my research is that poison ivy does phenomenally well with jumping worms. It's a great native species, great for wildlife, great for ground cover. People don't really take my advice to plant poison ivy, which is, fine. But there's other things that grow in a similar way to poison ivy that maybe are a little bit more palatable to your kids and your landscaping. So things like partridge berry, that you can think about, these kind of ground cover type crops. So I said we have no silver bullet for management of jumping worms. Some things that are in development are thinking about physical ways of bringing jumping worms down, like rototilling. One that's very promising is heat. So if you have raised beds or if you have access to a soil steamer or something like that, that can really knock out the jumping worm eggs at the beginning of the season or even now. So just like some clear plastic over your raised beds will really, really knock down the population in a big way. And especially the golf course industry, turf grass folks have been thinking about some chemical options. Most of the chemical options that we have now, even the sort of organic chemical options, seem to have some ecological consequences that aren't great. Especially where you are in Pennsylvania, you have a number of those native earthworms that we know so little about that are probably of great conservation concern. So you want to be really careful about just managing earthworms, managing jumping worms, just sort of off label. So not recommended, but some work being done. There might be something. And then there's some interesting things with biocontrol happening up at University of Vermont. So commercially available fungus might be an option. And jumping worms have a lot of parasites. So there might be something within that we can use for biocontrol. Right, so I want to thank you very much for your time and for your effort and your observations. And I'm going to turn it back over to Amy, and I will just zip through some of the comments. And I think at the end, we were going to do questions if people wanted to have like a more discussion type question, like a longer thing that isn't just a quick thing to put into the Q&A. Right, thanks a lot.
Yeah, Anise, there were some questions coming through, so you can feel free to answer them. And then if we have time at the end, we can actually go through and let others know about what's coming through the Q&A. So
All right,
thank you.
thanks a lot.
Okay. And Anise, can you confirm that you can see my screen?
I don't actually.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. All right. So again, Anise, thank you so much for that information. I appreciate all your expertise in this realm. I want to just keep going through and talk a little bit more about the event and specifically some IMAP invasives details for folks to know more about if you'd like to participate. So if you do not already have an IMAP invasives login account, you do want to make sure that you request one. You will need that in order to report data to IMAP invasives. And so the screenshots that I'm having here in my presentation show those steps of what you'll need to do to request an account. So if you go to our website, which is paimapinvasives.org, you'll see an area at the top where it says register or log in. You can click on either one of those and it will take you to this page where you can either log in if you have an existing account already, or you can complete this sign up form and that will allow you to register for an account. Okay, another key part of the Jamboree event, you will want to make sure that you join a particular project in IMAP Invasives called the Jumping Worm Jamboree 2024 project. So once you receive your account, you'll want to log into the IMAP Invasives online database and request to be a member in that project. And I have some screenshots below that will show you that process. So I'll show those in a minute. But I just want to mention too that after you do request to be part of the project, either myself or another IMAP Invasives administrator will actually approve your request. And then once that project approval has happened, you will receive an email letting you know, and then you can go out and start doing your surveys and tagging your information to this project. So again, just important to remember that all participants' survey data does need to be tagged to that Jumping Worm Jamboree 2024 project in order to qualify as part of this event. Also, if folks already have an existing IMAP Invasives account, you may have already been added to the project by an administrator. So you can check the project section of your IMAP Invasives account profile to see if that's the case. And if you've already been added to the project, you don't necessarily need to do that. So again, I'll show some screenshots of how you can check that. So first, how to join the project. If you're logged into the online IMAP Invasives database, go to where that upper left hamburger menu is. And if you click on that, one of the options is projects. So if you click on projects and then use that search bar to search for Jumping Worm Jamboree 2024, that should come up in the area just below that search box. And then if you click on that project and access the project profile page, there is an area where it says request to join project. So that's where you can actually click on that and a request will go through. Again, you'll need to wait for an administrator to approve that request. And when it does, we will let you know via email when that happens. To find out if you're already part of the Jumping Worm Jamboree project, if you've already been added by an administrator, again, log into the IMAP Invasives online database, access that menu in the upper left-hand corner, and then go to where it says your account, and it will pull up your account profile in IMAP Invasives. In there, there is a project section, and you can see if the Jumping Worm Jamboree 2024 is already listed in your project area. If it is, that means you're already a member. If it's not, you'll need to go through that process to request to be added to the project. So reporting your findings to IMAP Invasives is going to be one of the really big and most important parts of this event. And so for existing users, you may already be familiar with how to report your findings to IMAP Invasives, either through the mobile app or the online database. But if you are new to IMAP Invasives and don't yet know how to do that, there is information that we have here in the presentation and also some online videos that I have embedded here in my presentation that you can watch that show you what to do. So again, just keep in mind, we're looking to have folks record both presence and absence or that not detected information. So whether you do find jumping worms or you don't, either way, we're looking for you to record all of your survey findings. Just want to note the videos that I have that I'll show you here in a moment are not specific to the Jumping Worm Jamboree event, but they do show step-by-step instructions on how to report an invasive species to IMAP Invasives. So they're going to give you that base foundation of what you'll need to know in order to submit your findings. Again, just make sure that you are tagging all of your data to the Jumping Worm Jamboree 2024 project. And that's going to need to happen whether you're using the mobile app or the online database. If you are going to be using the mobile app to record your findings, this is really important. You want to first make sure that you access that online IMAP Invasives database and request to be a member of the project. And then after you do that, you can then add the project to your IMAP Invasives mobile app. So you can't add that project to your mobile app if you're not first a member of it by doing the process in the online database. And again, the video tutorial has more information about that if you have any further questions. Excuse me. So the the not detected reports, um, just in nature, because you're not actually finding any jumping worms when you're reporting not detected data, users can choose to include a photo of the area where you did your search as part of that report, or you can leave it blank as far as any photos. You do not necessarily need to include a picture in those records. So just want to mention, if you're unsure, if you're going out and doing your surveys and you're unsure if the worms that you found are jumping worms or perhaps a different type of earthworm, just go ahead and report your findings as jumping worms to IMAP invasives either way. So, excuse me, all the data that we have that gets submitted to IMAP invasives is always expert vetted. And so any incorrect species IDs are either remedied to be listed as the correct species, um, excuse me, or they're removed from the database if they're not found to be an invasive species. So you don't have to be an expert jumping worm identifier in order to participate in this event. We're just asking you to go out and survey and do the best you can. And we'll have folks that work for our IMAP invasives team and probably also Dr. Dobson help to review the data that comes in. So here's the video tutorials I was mentioning. The first one goes into detail about how to use the IMAP Invasives mobile app. So this is available here in this presentation and also available on YouTube. Something to keep in mind, there is a photo limit if you're using the mobile app. Only one photo can be added per record. However, if you access your database, if you access your records in the online database after you submit them, you can add additional photos to your records at that time. Or if you record data in the online database, you can add up to 5 images that way. So just keep that in mind. The mobile app is somewhat limited in the number of photos you can add per record. Here's some of the video tutorials that talk about how to record data in the online database. This is a video that talks about how to record presence information, and then a video that talks about how to record that not detected information. So after you've submitted data to IMAP, you may be interested in going in and viewing that. So you can view information that's been submitted by yourself as well as other participants of the event. And so there's a tool in IMAP Invasives called Filter Records, and that is the way that you can look at this information. So there is some screenshots here that show you that process. So if you're logged into the IMAP Invasives online database, near the top of the main map page, you'll see a button that says Filter Records. And if you click on that, a separate window will pop up. It has different tabs here at the top. It will default to the General tab. And on that tab is a section called Projects. So if you simply just query for the Jumping Worm Jamboree 2024 project and click Apply Filter, it will then ask you what data layers you want to have turned on as part of your search. And so you want to make sure you're turning on the confirmed, unconfirmed, and not detected information, which is all the types of data that can be reported as far as this event is concerned. So once you go through those prompts, the data will load on the map. Right now, there isn't any data because the event hasn't started yet. But as we get into July and people start reporting data, you can do this filter records tool and the search that it provides, and then zoom in on the map to actually see that information. If you're zoomed out on the map, it will look like a bunch of orange hexagons, which is just a way for the map speed to draw fairly quickly. But if you zoom in on the map to a certain scale level, those orange hexagons will be replaced with individual points, lines, and polygons that you can then see where specific reports are being made across the state. And you can then actually click on any of those points, lines, or polygons to view the individual records that you might be interested in looking at. If you're interested in only viewing your findings, you can do that as well. in that filter records tool, you can query for the project. And then there's a section where it says filter on your own records. That's a toggle switch that you can activate, and that will then show only the records that you have entered as part of the Jamboree event. So Anise mentioned several things as far as what to keep in mind when you're taking pictures of jumping worms, and I just want to reiterate a few of those things. She talked very specifically about some things to keep in mind with jumping worms, but other things just to keep in mind. You want to make sure you're taking really up close images of the worms that you observe. Try to avoid taking pictures from a distance because that's not going to allow an expert to get a good look at what you were seeing. You want to make sure your photos are clear and crisp, and you want to also ensure that your camera is focused on the target species and not necessarily something in the background. And this can happen sometimes. The camera on your phone or tablet might be a little confused of what it is that you're looking at and be focusing on perhaps the background image rather than what's in the foreground. And so you do want to make sure that your camera is focusing on what it should focus on. You might want to also include an item in your image that helps to show scale so you can get a sense of how large or small some of the worms are that you're finding. So things to think about would be a hand, a coin, or a ruler. But things that are more concrete in size that we know for sure what the size is, so that coin or ruler probably are your better bets, but a hand is also helpful as well. And then my last tip is probably one of the most important ones to remember. You want to make sure that your images that you're capturing include the jumping worm's distinguishing characteristics. So again, Dr. Dobson talked about some of those things in her presentation. Make sure you go back through and you familiarize yourself with those things because you do want to make sure that you include them in your pictures. That will allow an expert to differentiate what you're seeing from potential lookalike species and hopefully then be able to confirm your record in IMAP invasives as a jumping worm observation. So if you're interested in learning more about invasive jumping worms, there are a lot of really great online resources that are available. Here's just a few, but you can certainly look for others that are available. But I've got some resources. The first one is from Cornell University. It's an homeowner's guide to Asian jumping worms. The University of Maryland Extension also has some information about jumping worms. Penn State Extension has put together this really great video. It's called Asian Jumping Worms, Another Forest Foe. So I would encourage you to check that out. And then Dr. Dobson, along with a colleague of hers from the Yale School of the Environment, co-authored an article that was included in a previous edition of the Pennsylvania IMAP Invasives newsletter about jumping worms. It was called Invasive Jumping Worms, a Threat to Gardens, Ecosystems, and Landscapes. So you can check that out. All of these links here will take you right to those resources. And I just want to mention for any follow-up questions that folks might have after today's presentation, if you'd like to ask a question specific to jumping worms, please contact Dr. Dobson. Her contact information is listed here. And if you have any questions specifically about the Jumping Worm Jamboree, please contact me. My information is listed here, and an email is preferred over a phone call, but either contact ways are fine and will work. So with that, thanks everyone for attending. We will take some time here. We have some time left to look at some questions that have come through and answer some of those. So if anyone has any other questions that you would like to ask, now is the time to do so.
I actually I couldn't type anything into the type answers, so oh, now I can. I guess when you were talking, I couldn't type anything
Oh,
in.
gotcha. Okay.
Which, is probably a good feature. Um, okay, so I can just zip through them really quickly. So there were a couple of questions about the metallic sheen, and you're totally right. Jumping worms do have this metallic sheen. The reason I didn't use it as a diagnostic characteristic is that the nightcrawler can also look metallic, not quite as metallic, but if you just came across a nightcrawler in the sun, it can look metallic. And I had this moment in my master's degree where I found these very metallic looking night crawlers, and I just leaned up against a tree and started crying because I was so worried that I had introduced these jumping worms to this field site that I had been working at. But no, they were in fact night crawlers, so that was okay. They were there previously. But yeah, so they're it's not the perfect, it's not a fantastic. It's certainly true that they are metallic, not always metallic, and not the only ones that are metallic. Okay, why don't the castings break down or dissolve? They do break down a little bit, but they're really glued together with a lot of the gut contents of the jumping worms. It's not an accident that they make these castings like that. It's probably very adaptive. It's a great habitat for them, this deep layer that they can move through really, really quickly. If it gets dry, if it gets too hot, too cold, they can dive down, dive up. It erodes, and so then their cocoons move through the water. So it is really in their best interest for these castings to be quite sturdy. So yeah, they're glued together with a lot of the gut contents is why they don't break down too much or dissolve, but they do a little bit. Um, how do you get them inert to look at the hair-like setae? So you can sort of hold them between your fingers. A lot of the jumping is in the first 30 seconds, and then they kind of get tired. So you can hold them and look at that. If that's not working, they're pretty gross, if I'm being honest, pretty icky. So you can throw them in the freezer to either slow them down or kill them, and then you can look at the hair-like extensions. But once they start to melt, they will get pretty gross. So it's kind of a quick thing. Throw them in the freezer, pop them out, look really quick, and then don't hold on to them for too long. How are jumping worms different from the red wigglers that are sold for vermiculture? Okay, so red wigglers are in that lumbricid family. So they're not native to here, but they're pretty, they're kind of divas. They don't like to be too cold. They don't like to be out into the forest. So I've actually never, I don't think I've ever found one in the forest, and I've looked at thousands and thousands of worms. They tend to stick to the compost piles where it's warm. It stick to the worm bins where it's warm. So it might be a little bit different down further in Pennsylvania, but for the most part, red wigglers are not a huge problem in forests, even though they're not native. You can identify them. They don't move fast like the jumping worms, and they have this yellow band in between each segment. So they're also called tiger worms. So yeah, between each segment of the worm, you get this yellow stripe. So that's how you can know that they're red wigglers. And they also don't get very big. That's the other thing, not big like the jumping worms. How do you reach fishermen regarding their use as bait? So this is a bigger one more for the night crawlers because they're actually, even though I didn't talk about them being quite destructive, they are quite destructive in forests too. Those are the ones that classically would be used for bait. Jumping worms, every fisherman I've talked to says they're very not good for bait. They fall off the hook, the fish don't like them. But that doesn't mean that people don't buy them still. So it is an issue. So we've done things like published articles in like conservation magazines that are a little bit more aimed at hunting and fishing to kind of get the word around. But yeah, earthworms as bait, just generally not a great idea if you can find something else. What do you do if you find jumping worms in a purchased plant? Maybe Amy, I'm gonna leave that one for you. I don't know so much about specifics in Pennsylvania. I don't think there are any laws on the books about it or
I am not aware of anything.
Mhm.
So I would just probably recommend whatever you would say is the best practice, as far as if you do find them, how to
Yeah,
get
so
rid of
that
them.
yeah, so
Yeah.
definitely talking to the owner and there may be an invasive species hotline or like your local extension person. There's what are they called in Pennsylvania?
The Penn State Extension Services, I think, is what you're talking
Yeah, so there's probably a local office and they might have some extra guidance for you. Okay, what about other states? I'm in Virginia and jumping infestation. Can I report via IMAP invasives? So I'm not sure if Virginia has the whole profile of IMAP invasives, but actually for jumping worms anywhere in the country, even states that don't opt into the IMAP invasives portfolio, you can still report jumping worms no matter where you are. The other thing that yeah, so that's
And I would just add to that. So the thing to keep in mind is there are several participating states and provinces that use IMAP invasives. Of course, Pennsylvania and New York and several others are currently participating. Virginia is currently not participating. So what that means is you can report data if you're in Virginia, but no one's going to be vetting that information. So it will just essentially sit in the platform. So I would actually recommend for anyone that's in another state that doesn't have a participating IMET program to report your jumping worm findings to iNaturalist. That's another great place to make sure that information can easily get reported to. It's a very similar platform where you can report where you're finding it, and also some pictures. And then other users of the platform are actually the ones that help to identify a species if you're not sure what it is. So if you're outside of Pennsylvania, I would recommend using iNaturalist.
yeah, and the nice thing, right, IMAP Invasives and iNaturalist have a partnership with data partnership sharing. So the information will eventually, like twice a year, get pulled over to IMAP. Right? Is that right?
Yeah, there's actually a data layer available in IMAP Invasives that you can pull in the most recent 5 years worth of data from iNaturalist. And so that's available right now. And so that is something where you can have that connection, like what you're talking about, Dr. Dobson.
What's kind of cool is iNaturalist's AI app Seek. I was testing out some worms on it, and the AI can tell, at least with mature worms, that it was a jumping worm and not, it couldn't tell species, obviously, but that it was a jumping worm and not a lumbricid worm. So
That's awesome.
that was cool. Okay, we're at 12:01. Can I keep, there's a couple
I would
more.
say since this is being recorded, if folks have to jump off, they can jump off and we can keep answering questions and people can look at the recording later if they want to.
Great. Okay, so the poison ivy question, yes, I should have been a little bit more clear with my words on that one. So poison ivy grows really well where jumping worms are present, uh, but doesn't slow them down at all. In fact, yeah, that partnership of poison ivy and jumping worms is a very happy one. They both love each other. The prairie grass and like pollinator garden planting, they can withstand jumping worms more by keeping them out. So they will actually keep out the jumping worms a little bit. You'll still have jumping worms, but the population won't be as big. Yeah, so if you're trying to nudge out the worms, poison ivy is not your thing. They just they live in harmony together. Because they have very limited rooting, so they can root in really unstable soil, and they're not sort of keeping the worms, they're not keeping the worms out of anywhere. So the worms can still pass through very happily, keeps the soil nice and moist. And yeah, okay. So, okay. And then Amy, there's one for you. I think if we record an observation that is incorrect, will we receive any feedback so we can assure we improve our identification in future sightings?
Yeah, wonderful question. And yes, so as part of this specific event, we can make sure that any administrators that are vetting that information, if it is not correct, we can reach out to you and let you know. And that is certainly is a way for then folks to kind of improve their skills and learn by doing essentially. So yes, so we can certainly reach out to you and let you know if that's the case.
And then Gerard asked about linking up with other people in the area to do a survey together.
Yeah, so just a few thoughts there. The first thought I had, maybe you can link up with others from like-minded groups that are doing work with natural resources. So, perhaps a master gardening group or Penn State Extension. But another way to do it is as the event gets started and people start reporting data, what you can do is view the findings in IMAP invasives that are coming in. And if you find others from Lancaster County that are doing this event, you can see the names of the individuals. And if you one, I can maybe help to connect folks so that maybe there can be a partnership that way. But those are just some thoughts to share.
All right. And then Kirk asked, I've seen worms that were thrashing, but thought they weren't jumping worms because he didn't see the distinctive clitellum. Are there other worms that thrash like that? Can you review the clitellum if the clitellum is not present? All fantastic questions. So right, the clitellum only shows up when they are mature, which is going to be starting around now in some places. This year, for some reason, in Ithaca, it was later. Um, so right, just because you don't see the clitellum does not mean it's not a jumping worm. It could just be a juvenile. Um, so do some other worms thrash like that? In Pennsylvania, you might have some others in the family other than the three that are invading, but I think it'll probably be one of those. And I mean, thrashing is like in the eye of the beholder, right? But if there is that really distinctive thrashing and the snake-like movement across the top of the soil, that's probably jumping worms, even if you don't see the clitellum, just a juvenile. And yeah, we can review if the clitellum is not present. The picture needs to be very crisp and clear. And if you can, that's where including a little bit of the castings in the picture can be really helpful, or even like in the background, having some of the soil behind can be really helpful without the clitellum. Having that other characteristic can be a nice trick. Okay, and then there's a few more questions then for Amy and comments and things like that.
Yeah, sure. So one person asked if we can share this presentation with your various groups. By all means, please share this information out with anyone who you think would be interested. We're certainly helping to educate a broad audience on this topic. So please feel free to share the information. I will be sending out a follow-up email to anyone who registered for today's webinar. That includes a link to my presentation and a copy of Dr. Dobson's presentation as well.
And I
And
will add that Cornell University Homeowners Guide has has this information and a lot of the other practical tools. So if you're like a master gardener group or plant sale or landscaping industry or things like that, that's a nice resource that you can use for sort of a checklist, step-by-step guide.
yeah, I really like the Cornell guide as well. I think it's really well done. So thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah. And it was like a huge conglomerate of the different people working on jumping worms. So it's like the things we all agreed on. We don't always agree on everything.
And then we did have someone comment, I think, to an earlier question that came up as far as how to connect with other people. So there is also Pennsylvania Master Naturalists as well. Forgot to mention that. So thank you, Thomas, for reminding me. So you can certainly connect with them, and there may be some folks that either are participating or would be interested in participating in the Jumping Worm Jamboree. And then looks like one other question, Dr. Dobson, that would be good for you to answer. How many locations should be sampled in 1 acre?
So I think the kind of the rule for the New York State version of this was 100 meters away is a good, at least 100 meters away counts as another point. Um, and that works well for me, about 100 meters. On the other hand, if you see jumping worms in one place and then you walk 5 steps and there's absolutely no sign of them, having those two observations, detected and not detected, that would be extremely helpful also. So I don't have really a great answer, but uh, depending on in 1 acre, how much patchiness there is. So if it's all the same in 1 acre, just one observation. But if you're seeing some like patchiness with edges or proximity to streams or something like that, then you can take several in 1 acre.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that's all the questions that came through. If folks have any other questions after today's webinar, please feel free to reach out to either myself or Dr. Dobson. And again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We really appreciate your interest in this topic. And again, starting in July is when the Jamboree begins. So best of luck as everyone starts with their surveys across Pennsylvania. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.